Billionaire talks in foreign language to humiliate the maid daughter. He never expected this reply. Hello everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our new videos. It's quick, it's free, and it's the best way to help us bring you more dramatic, unforgettable stories. Your support truly means the world. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much, and now, let's jump back into the story. The words sliced through the air like broken glass, sharp and deliberate, meant to wound in a language she wasn't supposed to understand, but Claire had been waiting for this moment, and what came out of her 3-year-old daughter's mouth next would shatter everything Richard Ashford thought he knew about the people cleaning his floors. Richard Ashford stood beneath the towering crystal chandelier in his Pacific Heights mansion, his Italian leather shoes gleaming against the white marble floor that reflected his immaculate image back at him. At 40 years old, he had built an empire from nothing, tech investments that had multiplied into billions, real estate holdings across 3 continents, and a reputation for ruthless intelligence that made competitors nervous. His salt and pepper hair was styled perfectly, his charcoal suit tailored to emphasize the authority he wielded without effort. He was a man who had learned early that power meant never showing weakness, never admitting fault, and certainly never acknowledging the existence of those beneath his station unless absolutely necessary. The dinner party tonight would host senators, Silicon Valley titans, and old money families whose approval Richard had spent years cultivating. Everything had to be flawless. Everything had to prove that a self-made billionaire could command the same respect as those born into their fortunes. He scanned the great room with a critical eye, noting every detail, every surface that needed to shine, every corner that needed to be invisible in its perfection. That's when he noticed her. Margaret, the housekeeper, was on her hands and knees near the fireplace, scrubbing at a stubborn mark on the marble hearth. She was 30 years old, but exhaustion made her look older, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that had started to fray. Her uniform was crisp but worn at the edges, the fabric thin from too many washes. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who couldn't afford mistakes, someone for whom every job was a test of survival rather than a career. Beside her, 3-year-old Emma sat quietly on a small blanket, coloring in a battered book with crayons that were mostly broken stubs. The little girl had her mother's dark hair and something luminous in her eyes, an awareness that seemed unusual for her age. She hummed softly to herself, occasionally glancing up at her mother with a concern that children shouldn't have to carry. Richard's business associate, Vincent Torres, stood beside him, having arrived early to discuss the evening's strategy. Vincent was cut from the same cloth, wealthy, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He held a glass of 25-year-old scotch and surveyed the room with the casual disdain of someone who measured human worth in stock portfolios. "Your staff seems to be multiplying," Vincent said in flawless French, his lips curling into a smirk. "I didn't realize you were running a daycare along with a household." Richard chuckled, responding in the same language. "The maid claims she has no one to watch the child. Apparently, I'm supposed to be moved by her poverty. As if bringing her burden into my home somehow makes her more valuable." Vincent swirled his scotch, his eyes fixed on Margaret with the kind of contempt reserved for things found on the bottom of shoes. "I suppose we should be grateful she hasn't reproduced more extensively. Though I imagine the father, whoever he was stupid enough to be, ran the moment he realized what he'd gotten himself into. These people breed like rabbits and then expect society to care for the consequences. She's lucky I allow it at all," Richard continued in French, his voice carrying that particular edge of cruelty that men like him mistake for wit. "Though I suppose keeping her desperate keeps her compliant. A single mother with no options will scrub floors with more enthusiasm than someone who has choices. It's basic economics, supply, demand, and desperation." Margaret's hands slowed for just a fraction of a second on the marble, but she didn't look up. Her shoulders remained steady, her breathing controlled. She continued scrubbing with the same methodical precision, giving no indication that she understood a single word. This was the armor she had learned to wear: invisibility, silence, the appearance of not mattering enough to hear or comprehend the cruelty that rich men threw around like confetti. Emma, however, had stopped coloring. Her small head tilted upward, her eyes moving between the two men with an expression that was far too knowing for a 3-year-old. She set down her crayon with deliberate care, as if preparing for something important. Vincent leaned closer to Richard, dropping his voice slightly but still speaking in French. "I have to admire your efficiency. My own staff has become entitled, asking for holidays, better wages, respect." He practically spat the last word. "They forget that they exist to serve. Perhaps I should learn from your model. Keep them breeding and desperate. It certainly seems effective." Richard raised his glass in mock toast. "To the natural order of things. To those who build empires and those who clean up after them. May they never forget which side of the marble they belong on." Both men laughed, the sound echoing off the high ceilings and expensive art that lined the walls. It was the laughter of men who had never questioned their right to look down, who had built fortresses of wealth around themselves and called it earned, who confused cruelty with strength and called it sophistication. That's when Emma stood up. The movement was fluid and purposeful, not the clumsy scramble of a typical toddler. She walked forward with startling composure, her small shoes making almost no sound against the marble. She stopped directly in front of Richard and Vincent, her chin tilted upward so she could meet their eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was clear, precise, and utterly devastating. "Monsieur, votre arrogance est dépassée seulement par votre ignorance," Emma said in perfect, crystalline French. "Your arrogance is exceeded only by your ignorance." The Scotch glass in Vincent's hand wobbled. Richard's expression froze mid-smirk, his brain struggling to process what his ears had just registered. This 3-year-old child, this supposed burden, this symbol of poverty and desperation, had just addressed them in flawless French with the diction and vocabulary of someone who had studied at elite institutions. Emma wasn't finished. She continued in the same language, her small voice carrying a dignity that made the massive room suddenly feel too small for the men's egos. "My mother understands every word you've said. She has more education in her exhaustion than you have in all your expensive suits. But she has something you'll never possess: she has grace. She knows that true strength isn't measured in cruelty, and true worth isn't calculated in dollars. You see a maid. I see a woman who sacrifices everything so I might have what she was denied." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret slowly rose from her knees, turning to face the men who had just been dissected by her toddler. Her expression was unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes, not triumph exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement that masks had just been removed, and the evening Richard had planned so carefully was about to become something entirely different. Richard's mind reeled as he stared at the small child who had just demolished his carefully constructed superiority with words that shouldn't exist in her vocabulary, and the revelation of what Margaret had been silently absorbing threatened to crack the foundation of the empire he thought was built on merit alone. The crystal chandelier above seemed to cast harsher light somehow, illuminating the sudden vulnerability on Richard's face. His jaw worked soundlessly, the practiced smile of the supremely confident replaced by something raw and uncomfortably human: shock, yes, but also the dawning horror of someone who has just realized their private cruelties were never private at all. Vincent had taken 2 steps backward, his own face drained of color, the Scotch forgotten in his trembling hand. Margaret moved forward with slow, deliberate steps, placing her hand gently on Emma's shoulder. The gesture was protective but also restraining. A mother who knew her daughter had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, who understood that truth-telling in the houses of powerful men came with consequences that children shouldn't have to bear. "Emma, sweetheart, go back to your coloring," Margaret said softly in English, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been resignation or might have been the beginning of rebellion. Emma looked up at her mother, those knowing eyes searching for permission or perhaps forgiveness, before nodding and returning to her blanket. But the air in the room had fundamentally changed. The invisible walls that separated servant from master had become suddenly visible, revealed as the flimsy constructs they had always been. Richard found his voice first, though it came out rougher than intended. "You speak French." It wasn't a question exactly, but an accusation, as if Margaret's linguistic abilities were a personal betrayal rather than a skill he'd never bothered to ask about. "I speak 5 languages," Margaret replied, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time in the 8 months she'd worked in his home. "French, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, and English. I have a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown. I graduated summa cum laude. I was 3 months into my PhD program when my husband died in a car accident, leaving me with medical debt, funeral costs, and a 6-month-old daughter with no life insurance because we were young and stupid and thought we had time." Each word landed like a physical blow. Richard's carefully constructed narrative, the one where he was the brilliant self-made man surrounded by simple people who existed to facilitate his greatness, was crumbling in real time. Vincent had set down his glass and was edging toward the door, clearly wanting to escape this sudden eruption of uncomfortable reality. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength as years of swallowed humiliation found an outlet. "I took this job because I needed flexible hours for Emma, because I needed health insurance immediately, because I was drowning and this was the only hand extended. Not because I'm less intelligent than you. Not because I'm lazy or entitled or breeding irresponsibly. Because tragedy doesn't check your resume before it destroys your life, and survival requires swallowing pride along with everything else." "I didn't know," Richard said, and hated how weak it sounded, how inadequate. The words of a man who had built an empire by knowing everything about markets and nothing about the people who made his life possible. "You didn't ask," Margaret countered. "In 8 months, you've never once asked me a personal question beyond whether I could work extended hours. You've never asked about Emma beyond whether she'd be quiet. You've never looked at me long enough to see anything except a function, someone who scrubs and cleans and disappears." Vincent cleared his throat, his recovery instinct kicking in. "This is all very touching, but perhaps we should discuss." "Discuss what?" Margaret turned her full attention to him, and there was something fierce in her expression now, something that had been locked away for months of desperate employment finally breaking free. "How you casually discuss human beings as breeding problems. How you reduce single mothers to economic equations. How you congratulate each other on keeping people desperate enough to accept your scraps while you toast with scotch that costs more than my monthly rent." Vincent's face flushed red. "You're out of line. You work here. You don't get to." "I work here because I need to eat, because my daughter needs to eat, because medical debt doesn't forgive itself, and because the job market for widowed mothers with gaps in their employment history and a toddler in tow is roughly as welcoming as this conversation has been," Margaret said, her voice rising slightly. "But working here doesn't make me property. It doesn't make me deaf or stupid or undeserving of basic human dignity. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to discuss me like I'm livestock while I'm on my knees scrubbing your floors." Emma had stopped coloring entirely now, watching her mother with wide eyes that held a mixture of pride and fear. At 3 years old, she couldn't fully understand the economics of their situation, but she understood tone, understood that her mother was fighting something important, understood that the safety of their small world was suddenly precarious. Richard felt something uncomfortable churning in his chest, not quite guilt, because men like him had spent lifetimes learning to redirect that particular emotion, but something adjacent to it. Shame, perhaps. The recognition that the mirror Margaret was holding up reflected something uglier than he'd been prepared to see. "How much of tonight did you understand?" he asked quietly. "The other conversations. The other guests." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "All of it. Every dismissive comment about the help. Every joke about incompetence. Every assumption that because I wear this uniform, I must be simple. I've listened to senators discuss policies they claim will help people like me while simultaneously ensuring those policies have so many loopholes they're essentially just photo opportunities. I've heard business leaders congratulate themselves on charity donations that amount to less than they spend on watch collections while cutting wages for their actual employees. I've heard everything, Mr. Ashford. And I've said nothing because I need this job more than I need my dignity intact. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Vincent made another move toward the door, clearly done with this uncomfortable disruption to what should have been a simple evening of networking and mutual congratulation. But Richard remained frozen, his mind racing through months of conversations, of casual cruelties, of assumptions built on nothing but the accident of his success and her misfortune. "The dinner party," he said finally. "You're scheduled to serve tonight." Margaret nodded slowly. "I am. And I will. Because Emma needs health insurance and food and a roof over her head more than I need the satisfaction of walking out dramatically." "That's what you were counting on, wasn't it? That desperation is more powerful than pride. That someone with no options will endure anything. You weren't wrong. But now you know that I know exactly what I'm enduring, and why, and what it costs." She turned back to the fireplace, picking up her scrubbing brush with steady hands, and the gesture was more devastating than any dramatic exit could have been. This was the reality of survival, not grand gestures of defiance, but the quiet humiliation of returning to your knees because the alternative was worse. Emma returned to her coloring with the practiced ease of a child who had learned early that grown-up conflicts ended with mothers needing to work and daughters needing to be invisible. Richard watched them for a long moment, these two people he had dismissed as background characters in his carefully curated life, and realized with uncomfortable clarity that tonight's dinner party was about to become the most difficult performance of his career, and Margaret, the woman he'd never truly seen until this moment, would be watching every word with the full weight of her hidden intelligence and her undeniable dignity, judging whether he was capable of being anything more than the cruel man she'd just described. The doorbell chimed with the arrival of the first guests, and Richard felt the weight of his carefully constructed world bearing down as Margaret tied on her serving apron with hands that betrayed nothing of the earthquake that had just shattered the evening's foundation, but he could see her watching, waiting, measuring whether the man who had humiliated her would now reveal himself to be something worse in front of the people who controlled his future. Senator Patricia Caldwell swept through the entrance hall in a cloud of expensive perfume and political ambition, her silver hair styled in the kind of elegant waves that required daily attention from personal stylists. She'd built her career on family values rhetoric while her own children were raised by a succession of nannies she paid minimum wage. Behind her came Marcus Drummond, a hedge fund manager whose latest acquisition had displaced 3,000 workers while netting him a bonus that could have saved every single job with money left over for raises. Richard greeted them with the practiced warmth of a man who had learned to perform charm like a second language, but his eyes kept flickering toward the kitchen doorway where Margaret had disappeared. Vincent had recovered his composure and was already working the room, his earlier discomfort buried beneath layers of professional networking instinct. No one else knew that the evening's careful choreography had been disrupted before it even began. "Richard, darling, your home is absolutely stunning as always," Patricia said, accepting a glass of champagne from Margaret, who had emerged with a tray balanced perfectly on one hand. The senator didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the human being serving her, simply took the glass as if it had materialized from thin air through sheer force of her importance. Margaret's face was a mask of professional neutrality, but Richard saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or memory. He remembered suddenly that she'd said she understood everything, every conversation, every guest. That meant she'd heard Patricia's last visit, when the senator had spent 20 minutes explaining to donors why increased funding for childcare subsidies would create dependency, while simultaneously complaining that good nannies were impossible to find at reasonable prices. More guests arrived in a cascade of wealth and influence. Daniel Westbrook, a tech CEO whose company had just been exposed for manipulating user data while publicly championing privacy. Jennifer Chen, a philanthropist who funded women's shelters while running fashion companies with labor practices that kept women in poverty. Gregory Marshall, a real estate developer who built luxury condos on land seized through aggressive eminent domain from communities that couldn't afford lawyers good enough to fight back. This was Richard's world. These were his people. He'd fought for years to earn his place among them, to prove that new money could command the same respect as old, to demonstrate that a man from nothing could become someone. But tonight, with Margaret moving through the room like a ghost who'd learned to haunt quietly, he was seeing his achievement through different eyes. Emma had been settled in a small alcove off the kitchen with her coloring books and a promise from her mother to check on her every 15 minutes. The little girl sat with unusual stillness, understanding somehow that tonight required her to be even more invisible than usual. But when Richard passed by while his guests were distracted, he saw her watching the gathering with those two knowing eyes, and he wondered what kind of education a child received when their classroom was the servants' corner of wealthy homes. "Richard, I heard through the grapevine that you're considering the Riverside development," Gregory Marshall said, cornering him near the bar. "Bold move. That neighborhood has been resistant to progress for years. Lots of bleeding hearts crying about displacement and community character." He laughed as if the concept was absurd. As if keeping poor people poor is somehow compassionate. Richard opened his mouth to respond with the kind of agreement that had always come easily, but Margaret was refilling water glasses at the next table, and he knew she was listening. He knew she was cataloging every word, every casual dismissal of the people whose lives would be upended by the kind of development Marshall was praising. "I'm still evaluating the social impact," Richard heard himself say, and the words felt foreign in his mouth. "Profitability isn't the only metric worth considering." Gregory's eyebrows shot up. "Since when?" "Richard, you didn't build your empire by worrying about feelings. You built it by recognizing opportunity and taking it. That's what separates us from them." He gestured vaguely in a direction that might have indicated the kitchen, or the street, or perhaps the entire population of people whose bank accounts didn't have 7 digits. Vincent materialized at Richard's elbow, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp. "Perhaps we should discuss the Riverside project privately. Tonight is about celebration, not business." It was a smooth redirect, the kind of social lubrication that men like them excelled at, designed to steer conversations away from anything uncomfortable or complicated. But Patricia had caught the thread and wasn't letting go. "Oh, don't be coy. The Riverside project is brilliant. That area has been wasted on low-income housing for decades. Imagine what it could become with proper investment, restaurants, boutiques, luxury living. It's not displacement, it's transformation. We'd be doing those people a favor by forcing them to find opportunities elsewhere." Margaret was at the senator's shoulder now, refilling her champagne glass with steady hands. Patricia continued talking as if the woman holding the bottle was a piece of furniture. "These communities stagnate because they lack ambition. They need to be pushed out of their comfort zones. That's how progress happens." Richard watched Margaret's face for any reaction and found nothing. The mask was perfect, the invisibility complete. But he remembered what she'd said earlier about Georgetown, about her master's degree, about studying international relations and understanding policy at levels these people couldn't imagine from someone in a server's uniform. He wondered what she thought of Patricia's theories on poverty and ambition, what her analysis would be of policies designed by wealthy people who'd never missed a meal debating whether poor people deserved to eat. Dinner was announced, and guests migrated to the formal dining room where a table set with china worth more than most people's cars awaited them. Margaret and the 2 other servers moved like synchronized dancers, presenting courses with practiced efficiency. The meal was exquisite, each dish a small masterpiece of culinary art, the kind of food that treated eating as performance rather than sustenance. Conversation flowed with the wine, talk of market trends and political maneuvering, of vacations to private islands and complaints about staff who didn't understand that 16-hour days were just part of working for important people. Jennifer Chen launched into a story about firing her previous personal assistant for having the audacity to request maternity leave, framing it as a tale of unreasonable entitlement rather than human rights. "I mean, if you're going to have children, you need to plan for it not to interfere with your career," Jennifer said, laughing. "I have 3 kids and I never let it slow me down. Of course, I had the sense to hire full-time care. But you can't expect employers to subsidize your personal choices. Margaret was clearing plates when Jennifer said this, and Richard saw her grip tighten almost imperceptibly on the china. He thought about what she'd told him, about becoming a widow with a 6-month-old, about medical debt and impossible choices, about taking a job far below her education level because survival didn't wait for perfect circumstances. Emma appeared briefly in the doorway, and Margaret quickly moved to intercept her, murmuring something soft and steering her daughter back toward the alcove. But not before several guests noticed, their expressions ranging from mild irritation to open disdain at the breach of invisible barriers. "Is that the help's child?" Patricia asked, not bothering to lower her voice. "Richard, really? I know staff retention is challenging, but surely you can maintain some boundaries. This is your home, not a daycare. Employee, and I have a responsibility to ensure my employees can work without sacrificing their families," he said quietly. "Perhaps that's a principle worth considering more broadly." The table went silent. Vincent's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Patricia's smile froze in place. And Margaret, standing against the wall with an empty tray, finally met Richard's eyes with an expression he couldn't quite read: surprise, certainly, but also wariness, as if she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this moment of unexpected defense to reveal itself as another game being played by people who held all the cards. Richard's words hung in the candlelit air like a challenge he hadn't meant to issue, and suddenly the dinner party transformed into a battlefield where the weapons were polite conversation and the casualties would be reputations. But what none of his guests knew was that Richard had just glimpsed something that terrified him more than losing their approval: the possibility that he'd spent his entire life climbing a ladder propped against the wrong wall. Daniel Westbrook broke the silence with forced laughter. "Richard, you're joking, right? Employee welfare is one thing, but let's not pretend that domestic staff deserve the same considerations as actual professionals. These positions aren't careers, they're transitional work for people without better options. Why should lack of options mean lack of dignity?" Richard asked, surprising himself with the question. He could feel Vincent's eyes boring into him, telegraphing warnings about reputational damage and social capital. But he couldn't seem to stop himself. "Margaret has a master's degree from Georgetown. She's fluent in 5 languages. She understands policy and economics at levels most of us only pretend to. She's here because tragedy destroyed her finances, not because she lacks intelligence or ambition." The revelation detonated across the table. Patricia's champagne glass lowered slowly. Gregory Marshall's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been anger. Jennifer Chen looked at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time, and the recognition in her eyes wasn't admiration, it was threat assessment. "A Georgetown graduate cleaning your house?" Marcus Drummond said slowly. "That seems like a rather significant waste of education. Surely if she's as qualified as you claim, she could find appropriate employment. Unless, of course, there are other factors at play. Performance issues, perhaps. Character problems." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, still playing her role as invisible servant. Richard felt anger flare in his chest, not the cold, calculating anger he used in business negotiations, but something hotter and more personal. "The factor at play is a dead husband, a baby, and medical debt that would crush most people," Richard said flatly. "The factor is a job market that sees a gap in employment history and a need for flexible hours and decides a woman isn't worth the investment. The factor is that we've built an economy where one piece of bad luck can permanently derail someone's trajectory, and then we blame them for not recovering fast enough." Vincent stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. "Richard, might I speak with you privately?" "Now." It wasn't a request. Richard excused himself, following Vincent into his study while the remaining guests exchanged glances that mixed shock with schadenfreude. The moment the door closed, Vincent exploded. "What the hell are you doing? Do you understand what you just did in there? You basically called everyone at that table cruel and morally bankrupt. These are your investors, your political connections, the people who determine whether you're accepted or excluded from the circles that matter. Maybe they are cruel, Richard said quietly. Maybe we all are. Maybe I've spent so long trying to earn their approval that I became exactly like them without noticing. Vincent stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. One afternoon. That woman and her child have been here one afternoon's worth of revelation, and you're willing to throw away everything you've built? Your reputation? Your social standing? For what, Richard? A burst of conscience that'll fade in a week? You said she breeds like a rabbit, Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. You stood in my home and discussed a woman and her child, a child who speaks better French than your own kids, by the way, as if they were vermin. And I laughed. I participated. I was grateful for the camaraderie of shared contempt. Because that's how the world works. Vincent shot back. We're successful because we don't drown in empathy. We see opportunities, we make hard choices, we prioritize results over feelings. That's not cruelty, Richard. That's leadership. That's what separates the people who build empires from the people who clean them. Richard moved to the window, looking out at the San Francisco skyline glittering with the accumulated wealth of people who'd made exactly the choices Vincent was defending. My father was a janitor, he said quietly. Did you know that? I don't talk about it much. Not exactly the origin story that plays well at fundraisers. He cleaned office buildings at night so I could go to decent schools during the day. He died when I was 17, heart attack from decades of stress and terrible health insurance. Vincent's expression softened slightly. Richard, I know your background. Everyone knows you're self-made. That's part of your brand. But you're not your father anymore. You've earned the right to stand where you're standing. You don't owe anything to people who made different choices. That's the thing, though. Richard turned to face him. I didn't make different choices. I made lucky ones. I got scholarships. I met the right people. I started a company at exactly the right moment in exactly the right market. If my father had died when I was younger, if my mother hadn't had family support, if any one of 1,000 variables had been different, I could be the one scrubbing floors in someone else's mansion while they mock my life in languages they think I don't understand. But you're not, Vincent said firmly. You won. That's what matters. And if you go back in there and continue this performance of social consciousness, you're going to lose everything. Patricia controls committees that could kill your development projects. Gregory has connections to financial regulators who could make your life very difficult. Daniel's company handles your data infrastructure. You need these people, Richard. Your principles are going to cost you more than you can afford. Richard looked at his friend, because Vincent was his friend, in the transactional way that men like them defined friendship, and felt the distance between them stretching into something unbridgeable. What if being able to afford it is the whole problem? What if we've built lives where cruelty is just the price of admission and we've all agreed to pay it without asking if there's another option? Vincent's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at Richard with an expression that mixed frustration with something that might have been genuine concern. I have to go. Client emergency. But Richard, listen to me carefully. Whatever moral crisis you're having right now, whatever guilt that woman and her French-speaking kid have triggered in you, you need to work through it privately. In there, he gestured toward the dining room, you need to be the Richard Ashford who built $1 billion empire. Not the janitor's son having an existential breakdown. He left without waiting for a response, and Richard stood alone in his study surrounded by the symbols of his success, awards, photos with politicians and celebrities, framed articles from Forbes and Fortune celebrating his business acumen. The man in those photos looked confident, powerful, certain of his place in the world's hierarchy. Richard barely recognized him. When he returned to the dining room, the conversation had moved on but the atmosphere remained strained. Margaret was serving dessert, her movements efficient and professional, but Richard noticed details he'd never registered before, the way her shoes were worn at the heels, the careful precision with which she handled items worth more than her monthly salary, the practiced invisibility that came from years of learning to not matter in spaces like this. Emma appeared again in the doorway, and this time Margaret couldn't intercept her quickly enough. The little girl walked straight to her mother, holding up her coloring book with the pride of a 3-year-old who'd accomplished something important. "Mama, I finished the castle. And I made the princess look like you." The room froze. Patricia's expression curdled. Jennifer exchanged a look with Gregory that spoke volumes about their shared disdain for children who didn't understand proper boundaries. But Richard saw something else in that moment, saw Emma's complete trust in her mother, saw Margaret's protective love battling with her desperate need to keep this job, saw the impossible position they were in every single day. He stood, drawing every eye to him. "I think," he said carefully, "it's time I was honest with all of you about some decisions I've been considering. Patricia, your development committee needs to know I'm withdrawing from the Riverside project. Gregory, I won't be moving forward with any ventures that require displacing established communities. Jennifer, I'm implementing new labor policies across all my holdings that include parental leave, living wages, and benefits that don't bankrupt families. And I'm announcing a scholarship fund for people, especially single parents, trying to rebuild careers after personal tragedies." The silence was deafening. Then Patricia set down her dessert fork with deliberate care. "I see. Well, Richard, it seems you've had quite the revelatory evening. I hope you'll forgive us if we find your sudden conversion to social justice somewhat performative. Call me when you're ready to do business like an adult again." She stood, and like dominoes falling, the other guests followed. Within 15 minutes, Richard's carefully curated dinner party had emptied out, leaving him standing in his immaculate dining room surrounded by half-eaten desserts and the wreckage of his social standing. Margaret stood frozen by the kitchen door, Emma clutched against her side, both of them staring at him with expressions that mixed shock with disbelief. And Richard realized he had absolutely no idea what came next, only that for the first time in years, he'd made a choice that felt like it might actually matter. The mansion felt cavernous in the silence that followed the exodus of guests, every empty room echoing with the ghost of Richard's former life, and as Margaret stood uncertainly between staying and leaving, both of them understood that the masks they'd been wearing had been shattered beyond repair, but neither knew if what lay beneath was strong enough to build anything worth keeping. Richard loosened his tie, the gesture mechanical, his hands moving while his brain tried to process the magnitude of what he'd just done. He'd spent 15 years building his reputation, cultivating relationships with exactly the kind of people who just walked out of his house radiating disapproval and social excommunication. In the space of one dinner, he'd become the thing men like him feared most, someone who'd broken ranks, who'd violated the unspoken rules of their class, who'd suggested that maybe the system that elevated them was fundamentally broken. Margaret hadn't moved. She stood holding Emma, who had buried her face in her mother's shoulder with the instinct children have for sensing when grown-up problems are bigger than they can understand. The serving apron still tied around Margaret's waist seemed absurd now, a costume from a play they were no longer performing. "You should sit down," Richard said, gesturing to the chairs his former guests had vacated. The words felt inadequate, ridiculous even, but he didn't know what else to say. Margaret shook her head slowly. "Mr. Ashford." "Richard. Please. I think we're past Mr. Ashford." "Richard," she corrected, and the name sounded strange in her mouth, as if speaking it dissolved some barrier that had kept them in separate worlds. "I don't understand what just happened. I don't understand why you did that." Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not sure I do either. 6 hours ago, I was a successful man hosting a dinner party to cement business relationships. Now I'm a social pariah who just committed financial suicide by alienating every important connection I've spent years cultivating. All because a 3-year-old spoke French." "Emma doesn't usually do that," Margaret said quietly. "I've taught her that what we hear in these houses stays in our heads. That survival means invisibility. But tonight..." She trailed off, looking down at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Tonight she decided our dignity mattered more than our safety. Emma lifted her head, looking between her mother and Richard with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes. The mean men were wrong, Mama. You always say when people are wrong, we should speak up. Even when it's scary. Adults don't get to be brave, Margaret said softly, stroking her daughter's hair. Adults have bills and responsibilities and consequences. Children get to have principles. Adults get to have survival. Maybe that's the problem, Richard said, pulling out a chair and sitting heavily. Maybe we've all decided that growing up means abandoning principles for pragmatism, and we've convinced ourselves that's wisdom instead of cowardice. Margaret finally moved, settling Emma into a chair with her coloring book before sitting across from Richard. She looked exhausted, not just physically, though the long day had clearly drained her, but existentially tired in the way people get when they've been carrying impossible weights for too long. Why did you really do it? She asked. And don't tell me it's because Emma impressed you with her vocabulary or because I have a degree you didn't know about. Men like you don't blow up their lives over staff members they barely see. So what was it? Guilt? Some kind of midlife crisis? A need to feel heroic? The question was sharp, skeptical, and entirely fair. Richard considered lying, considered crafting a response that would make him look better, more noble, more certain than he felt. But the evening had already stripped away too many pretenses to start building new ones. I saw myself, he admitted. When Vincent and I were talking about you and Emma, when we were laughing about desperation and poverty like it was dinner entertainment, I saw my father. I saw the janitor who raised me, who would have been scrubbing these same floors if he'd lived long enough. And I realized that somewhere along the way to becoming successful, I'd become the kind of man who would have mocked him. Who would have looked at his sacrifices and his struggles and his humanity and seen nothing but a function. Something to use and dismiss. Margaret studied him with an expression he couldn't read. So this is about your dead father? Your guilt about forgetting where you came from? That's not actually about me, Richard. That's about you feeling better about yourself. Maybe, he conceded. Probably. I don't know how to untangle my motivations cleanly. But Margaret, whether my reasons are pure or not, you understood every word said in this house tonight. You listened to senators discuss policies that hurt people like you while pretending to help. You heard business leaders casual about destroying communities. You absorbed all of it while scrubbing floors and serving wine, and you did it because you had no choice. And when I finally saw that, really saw it, I couldn't pretend I was different from the people who put you in that position. You are different, Margaret said flatly. They inherited wealth or married into it or stumbled into the right venture capital at the right time. You built everything from nothing. That actually means something. Does it? I used my father's death as motivation to never be poor again. I made decisions based entirely on accumulation, of wealth, of power, of status. I stepped on people when it served me. I justified it by saying I was just playing the game better than others. But tonight, I realize the game itself is rigged, and winning at it just makes you another rigger. Emma had stopped coloring and was listening with the focused attention children give to conversations they sense are important. Mr. Richard is the prince who breaks the curse, she announced solemnly. That's how the stories work. Someone has to be brave first before everybody else can be free. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Emma, sweetheart, this isn't a fairy tale. Mr. Richard just sacrificed his business relationships for a symbolic gesture that doesn't actually change anything structural. Tomorrow I'll still be desperate for this job. You'll still need health insurance. The bills will still come. Good intentions don't pay rent. So what do you want me to do? Richard asked, and it came out more desperate than he'd intended. Go back to being the man I was this morning? Pretend tonight didn't happen? Send you back to scrubbing floors while I rebuild relationships with people who see you as furniture? I want you to be realistic, Margaret said wearily. I want you to understand that dramatic gestures feel revolutionary in the moment but rarely change systems. You can't personally fix everything that's broken about how this country treats poor people. You can't scholarship fund your way out of structural inequality. And you definitely can't expect me to be grateful for a grand gesture that might have cost you some dinner invitations but could cost me everything. Then tell me what would actually help, Richard said. Not symbolically. Not in some grand gesture way. Actually, practically, what would change things? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Richard saw her weighing options, calculating risks, trying to decide if honesty was worth the potential cost. Finally, she spoke. Hire me for what I'm actually qualified to do. Your company has an international relations division. You work with overseas partners, navigate policy implications, coordinate with governments. I could do that job better than most of the people you currently employ because I actually understand the cultural contexts, speak the relevant languages, and have academic training in exactly those areas. But you won't, because I'm a housekeeper and making that leap would be too uncomfortable, too weird, too much of an admission that you've been wasting resources keeping me invisible. The challenge hung between them, and Richard felt the weight of it. This wasn't about charity or symbolic gestures. This was about whether he had the courage to actually see someone's abilities instead of their circumstances, to trust talent regardless of where he'd found it, to do something that would make his remaining business associates uncomfortable rather than just the ones who'd already left. You're right, he said quietly. It would be uncomfortable. It would raise questions. It would make people think I'm losing my judgment, that I'm making emotional decisions instead of rational ones. Margaret nodded, standing up as if preparing to leave. I understand. It was unreasonable to suggest. I should. When can you start? Richard interrupted. She froze. What? Monday. Tuesday if you need time to arrange childcare, though I'm implementing an on-site daycare situation for all employees with young children, so Emma can be nearby. The position is Director of International Relations. Salary is commensurate with the role and your qualifications, which means approximately 15 times what I'm currently paying you to clean. Benefits include full health coverage, retirement matching, education fund for Emma, and enough stability that you never have to scrub another floor unless you specifically enjoy it as a hobby. Margaret sat back down slowly, as if her legs had stopped working. You're serious. I just destroyed 15 years of carefully cultivated social capital. I might as well get something meaningful out of it. And Margaret, if you're half as qualified as I suspect you are, hiring you isn't charity. It's the first actually smart business decision I've made in months. Emma clapped her hands together, the sound sharp in the quiet room. See, Mama? The prince broke the curse. Now we can all live differently. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she didn't bother hiding them. I don't know what to say. I don't know if this is real or if you'll change your mind tomorrow when you realize what you've actually lost tonight. Maybe I will, Richard admitted. Maybe this is a massive mistake and I'll regret everything. But for the first time in years, I think I might be making a mistake that points towards something better instead of something that just makes me wealthier. That has to count for something. They sat there in the wreckage of the dinner party, surrounded by expensive china and abandoned desserts, three people whose lives had just been fundamentally altered by truth-telling and the collapse of pretense. Outside, the San Francisco night glittered with the lights of 1,000 other homes where similar dramas played out quietly, where dignity battled with survival, where choices were being made about who mattered and who didn't. Richard didn't know if he'd made the right decision. But for the first time in his adult life, he'd made one that felt like it might actually align with the values his father had tried to instill before poverty and exhaustion had killed him. That would have to be enough, at least for tonight. The weeks that followed Richard's dinner party disaster were brutal in ways he hadn't fully anticipated, and as his former colleagues worked to systematically dismantle his business empire piece by calculated piece, he discovered that Margaret's talents weren't just academic credentials on paper, she was about to save everything he'd risked while teaching him what real partnership looked like when it wasn't built on exploitation. The first blow came from Patricia Caldwell's office, a terse email informing Richard that his applications for 3 major development permits had been re-evaluated and denied due to community impact concerns. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same objections he'd raised during the dinner party were now being weaponized against him by a woman who'd never genuinely cared about community impact in her life. This was punishment disguised as policy. Gregory Marshall pulled funding from 2 joint ventures, his lawyers finding obscure clauses that technically allowed the withdrawal but were clearly pretexts for social exile. Marcus Drummond spread rumors through financial networks that Richard was unstable and making emotional rather than rational business decisions, effectively poisoning wells Richard hadn't even approached yet. Within 3 weeks, Richard's net worth had dropped by approximately $200 million. It was the kind of financial hemorrhaging that would have destroyed most people. Richard felt it as a tightness in his chest, a persistent anxiety that woke him at 3 a.m. calculating losses and running scenarios. But underneath the fear was something unexpected, a strange sense of relief, as if he'd been carrying weight he didn't know about until it was gone. Margaret started on a Tuesday. She arrived in professional attire that Richard suspected represented a significant portion of her savings, a navy suit that was well cut but not expensive, shoes that were polished but showed years of wear. Emma was enrolled in the hastily arranged on-site childcare, a room Richard had converted from his seldom-used home gym into a bright space with books and educational toys and a qualified teacher who genuinely seemed to enjoy children rather than simply tolerating them for a paycheck. The first thing Margaret did was request access to all of Richard's international contracts and partnership agreements. The second thing she did was disappear into his office for 18 hours straight, emerging with notes that covered 6 legal pads and an expression that mixed professional concern with something that might have been vindication. "You're being systematically targeted," she said without preamble, spreading documents across his desk. "But they're being obvious about it, which means they're angry rather than strategic." Patricia's permit denials violate 3 different municipal codes. Gregory's funding withdrawal actually breaches his fiduciary duty to his own investors because your joint ventures were profitable. And Marcus's rumors constitute actionable defamation. They're assuming you won't fight back because fighting back would require going to war with people who control regulatory mechanisms and financial networks. "That's a correct assumption," Richard said tiredly. "I don't have the energy or resources to fight battles on that many fronts simultaneously." Margaret smiled, and it was sharp enough to draw blood. "You don't have to fight on their territory. That's the mistake they're making, assuming you'll play by rules they control. But you have international holdings they can't touch, partnerships in markets where Patricia's committee has no jurisdiction, and relationships with foreign investors who don't care about San Francisco's social politics. We pivot. We stop trying to build in markets they control and start building in places where your reputation for actually giving a damn about social responsibility makes you more attractive, not less." She pulled out a tablet, swiping through presentations she'd apparently prepared overnight. "South Korea has new regulations requiring foreign developers to demonstrate social responsibility metrics. Your recent positions make you uniquely qualified compared to competitors who can't credibly claim to care about community impact. Singapore is prioritizing partnerships with companies that have strong labor practices. The European Union is implementing preference policies for businesses that meet certain ethical standards. These aren't fringe markets, Richard. These are trillion-dollar economies where doing what you did at that dinner party, taking a stand for actual principles, isn't social suicide. It's a competitive advantage." Richard stared at the data she'd compiled, feeling something shift in his understanding of the situation. "You did this in one night?" "I did this over 8 months of listening to conversations in this house and thinking about how fundamentally stupid your entire approach to international expansion has been," Margaret said bluntly. "You've been trying to compete in markets that are already saturated, fighting for approval from gatekeepers who will never fully accept you anyway because you weren't born into their class. Meanwhile, you've ignored entire sectors where your actual background, understanding what it's like to struggle, knowing what working-class people need, having personal experience with economic precarity, would make you more credible than the competition. She pulled up another presentation, this one showing demographic data and market analyses. Low-income housing in developing markets. Microfinance infrastructure. Educational technology for underfunded schools. Healthcare solutions for communities without insurance access. These are billion-dollar industries where most developers fail because they don't actually understand their customers. You do. Or at least, you're closer than most billionaires who've never worried about rent. This is still capitalism, Richard said slowly. I'd still be profiting from need. Yes, Margaret agreed. But you'd be profiting by actually addressing need rather than exploiting it. And before you start philosophizing about whether ethical capitalism is an oxymoron, let me be clear, I'm not interested in your moral redemption arc. I'm interested in keeping my job, providing for my daughter, and maybe, just maybe, demonstrating that it's possible to make money without being a complete monster. Small goals, but I'm ambitious. Richard laughed despite himself. You're kind of terrifying when you're not pretending to be invisible. I've been terrifying the entire time. You just weren't paying attention. She pulled up one more document. This is a proposal for a development project in Manila, mixed-income housing that's actually integrated instead of just poor people's buildings next to rich people's buildings. Local government is interested. Initial investors from Seoul and Taipei are enthusiastic because it fits their corporate social responsibility mandates. Projected returns are moderate but stable, and the social impact metrics are strong enough that you could use this as a flagship for completely repositioning your brand. From ruthless billionaire to, what? Benevolent billionaire? Richard asked skeptically. From ruthless billionaire to practical billionaire who figured out that screwing people over has diminishing returns, Margaret corrected. You're not going to out ruthless people like Patricia and Gregory. They've spent their entire lives perfecting that particular skill set. But you might be able to outcompete them by being the rare wealthy person who actually delivers on promises, treats workers like humans, and builds things that communities want instead of things that displace communities. Over the following weeks, they worked 16-hour days rebuilding Richard's strategy from the ground up. Emma would fall asleep in the corner of Margaret's office, curled up with her coloring books, while her mother negotiated with international partners in 3 different languages and Richard learned to approach business development as something other than conquest. Vincent called once, ostensibly to check in but really to assess whether Richard had come to his senses. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable, ending with Vincent's thinly veiled suggestion that Richard was throwing away his legacy for politically correct nonsense, and Richard's realization that they no longer spoke the same language even when using the same words. The bleeding stopped gradually. New partnerships formed in unexpected places. A Seoul-based investment group funded the Manila project. A non-profit focused on educational technology recruited Richard for an advisory board specifically because of his dinner party stance, which had apparently gone viral in social impact circles as an example of wealthy accountability. Media coverage was mixed, some outlets praised his pivot, others mocked it as performative, but the attention itself was valuable in markets where American developers were often viewed with suspicion. Margaret proved to be not just qualified but exceptional at her job. She had instincts for cultural nuance that prevented expensive mistakes, language skills that eliminated the need for translators, and an ability to connect with partners from working-class backgrounds who were inherently suspicious of billionaires. She also had no patience for Richard's occasional backsliding into old patterns of thinking. "We're not helping these communities," she corrected him sharply during one meeting. "We're partnering with them for mutual benefit. The moment you start framing this as charity or benevolence, you've already lost the plot. They have resources we need, local knowledge, community trust, cultural understanding. We have resources they need, capital, technical expertise, development experience. It's exchange, not salvation." Richard found himself constantly recalibrating his language, his assumptions, his approach. It was exhausting. It was also the most intellectually engaging work he'd done in years. He'd spent so long optimizing for profit that he'd forgotten that problems could be interesting, that challenges could be meaningful, that success could be measured in metrics other than accumulation. Emma started calling him Mr. Richard who learns things, which her mother explained meant he'd earned the 3-year-old's approval for being willing to admit when he didn't know something. It shouldn't have mattered, the opinion of a small child shouldn't have factored into Richard's self-assessment. But somehow, it did. Somehow, the idea that he was modeling something better than arrogance for a kid who was watching everything felt important in ways his previous successes never had. 6 months after the dinner party, Richard's net worth had stabilized at approximately $600 million, still wealthy beyond most people's comprehension, but a significant decline from his previous position. He was no longer invited to certain fundraisers. His name was conspicuously absent from guest lists that would have automatically included him before. But he was building something that felt more durable than social approval, more meaningful than wealth accumulation, more aligned with the values his father had died too young to see him embrace. And Margaret, who had started as invisible furniture in his home, was now his partner in the truest sense, someone whose judgment he trusted, whose insights shaped strategy, whose presence made him question assumptions he'd held so long they'd become invisible. They weren't friends exactly, and certainly weren't equals in terms of ownership or control. But they were collaborators in something that mattered, and that was more than Richard had ever had with people he'd called friends before. 2 years after a 3-year-old child spoke French in a billionaire's mansion, Richard Ashford stood in a community center in Manila watching Emma, now 5, teach local children English words through songs her mother had composed, and he understood finally that redemption wasn't a destination you arrived at but rather a direction you chose to keep walking even when the path was harder than the roads you'd abandoned. The community center was part of the mixed-income housing development that had become Richard's flagship project, not his most profitable venture, but his most meaningful. The building was designed in collaboration with future residents rather than imposed on them, incorporating cultural preferences and practical needs that outside developers consistently missed. The result was architecture that felt lived in rather than imposed, community spaces that were actually used rather than decoratively empty. Margaret stood beside Richard, watching her daughter with the expression mothers get when they're simultaneously proud and terrified of how fast children grow. She wore professional attire that she could now actually afford rather than barely sustain, her hair styled in a way that suggested time for personal care rather than constant survival mode. She looked younger than she had 2 years ago, despite being older, as if the weight of desperation had been aging her prematurely and its absence had allowed her actual age to reassert itself. "She wants to be a teacher," Margaret said softly. "Last week she announced that when she grows up, she's going to teach rich kids about empathy. Very specific career goal for a 5-year-old. Richard smiled. "She's got the language skills for it." "How many languages is she up to now?" 6. She picked up Tagalog from playing with kids here, and she started learning Arabic from that children's educational program. "I'm raising a tiny polyglot who uses her powers for social criticism and teaching. I don't know whether to be proud or worried." "Both seems reasonable," Richard said. "She's kind of an intimidating human for someone who still needs help reaching light switches." They'd fallen into an easy rapport over 2 years of working together, not quite friendship, because the power differential and complicated origin of their partnership created boundaries that couldn't be fully erased, but something warmer than pure professional collaboration. They challenged each other constantly, disagreed frequently, and had built something that neither could have created alone. The Manila project had been successful enough to spawn similar developments in 3 other cities. Richard's repositioned company was now known for ethical development practices that actually delivered on promises rather than just marketing them. Profit margins were lower than his previous ventures, but stability was higher, and more importantly, he could actually explain what he did for a living without internal cringing at the human cost. Patricia Caldwell had been voted out of office 6 months earlier, caught in a corruption scandal that had nothing to do with Richard but felt like poetic justice anyway. Gregory Marshall's real estate empire was facing multiple lawsuits from displaced communities who'd found lawyers good enough to fight back. Vincent had stopped calling entirely, having written off Richard as a cautionary tale about the dangers of conscience in capitalism. But Richard had new colleagues now, social entrepreneurs who were trying to prove that profit and ethics weren't mutually exclusive, impact investors who measured success in multiple dimensions, non-profit leaders who were willing to partner with businesses that genuinely wanted to help rather than just appear helpful. These relationships lacked the exclusive prestige of his previous network, but they had something his old connections never offered: honesty about motivations and genuine collaboration rather than competitive performance. Emma finished her teaching session and ran over, launching herself at Richard with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd known him for most of her remembered life. He'd become Uncle Richard somewhere along the way, the honorary title bestowed by a kid who understood family was about chosen bonds rather than just blood. "Mr. Richard, I taught them kindness and sharing and justice," Emma announced proudly. "Big words for big ideas. Just like you and Mama teach me." "Those are excellent words," Richard agreed seriously. "Though I think your pronunciation of justice is better than mine. You do this thing with the emphasis that makes it sound more important." Emma nodded sagely. "Important words should sound important. That's teaching rule number 1. Margaret laughed, scooping up her daughter. "Teaching rule number 1 is actually that you need certifications and degrees, but we'll get there. Right now, teaching rule number 1 is that teachers need lunch. Say goodbye to the kids." As Emma waved to her temporary students, Richard felt his phone buzz with the distinctive pattern that meant his assistant needed him. The message was brief but significant. A major investment group wanted to discuss funding for a large-scale project in Mumbai, specifically requesting Richard's company because of their track record on ethical development and community integration. "Big opportunity?" Margaret asked, reading his expression. "Potentially massive. Also potentially a lot of new challenges in markets we don't have deep experience in yet." "So we learn," Margaret said simply. "We find local partners who do have deep experience. We listen instead of assuming. We build relationships instead of just transactions. Same model we've been using, just bigger scale." "Just like that? No concerns about overextending?" "Oh, I have about 40 concerns and I'll be presenting them in a detailed memo tomorrow," Margaret said. "But concerns are different than objections. We can mitigate concerns. The question is whether this aligns with what we're actually trying to build, and whether we can execute without betraying the principles that got us here." Richard looked at her, this woman who'd entered his life scrubbing floors while he mocked her in languages he thought she didn't understand, who'd proven to be not just qualified but essential to everything he'd built since that disastrous dinner party. "You know we're not done proving ourselves, right? There are still people who think this whole thing is performative. That I'm just a billionaire playing at consciousness to rehabilitate my image." "Probably some truth to that," Margaret said pragmatically. "Motivation is always mixed. You can simultaneously want to do better and want to feel better about yourself. The question isn't whether your motivations are pure. Nobody's motivations are pure. The question is whether the outcomes are actually beneficial, whether we're causing less harm and creating more good than the alternative." Emma, still in her mother's arms, looked at Richard with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes that had started this entire journey. "Are you still the prince who broke the curse, Mr. Richard?" "I think I'm just a guy who's trying to do better than he did before," Richard said honestly. "Some days I succeed. Some days I fail. But I'm trying, and I've got people around me who won't let me forget why trying matters." "That's the same thing," Emma declared with the certainty of a 5-year-old who hadn't yet learned that adults complicated everything. "In all the best stories, the prince doesn't stop being brave after the first brave thing. He keeps being brave every day, even when it's hard. That's what makes him actually heroic instead of just lucky." Margaret met Richard's eyes over her daughter's head, and something passed between them, acknowledgement, maybe, or shared understanding of the strange path that had brought them from employer and servant to partners in something more complicated than either role suggested. They weren't equal, not really. The power differential remained in income, in ownership, in ultimate authority. But they'd built something that approached partnership in ways Richard's previous relationships never had. "Mumbai," Margaret said. "We'll need to visit for at least a month to properly understand the context. Emma's school can accommodate remote learning, and honestly, the exposure to new cultures is probably more educational than kindergarten math anyway." "You're sure? That's a big disruption to your lives." "Our lives have been one big disruption for 7 years," Margaret said practically. "The question isn't whether change is disruptive. The question is whether the disruption moves us towards something better or just something different. This feels like better." Richard nodded, pulling out his phone to respond to his assistant. As he typed, he could hear Emma chattering to her mother about all the languages she'd need to learn for Mumbai, and Margaret patiently explaining that they'd start with one at a time. The sounds were domestic and warm and entirely different from the sterile perfection of his mansion 2 years ago, when every surface gleamed with professional cleaning and every room echoed with the emptiness of achievement without meaning. He'd lost money, status, and social connections that had once seemed essential to his identity. He'd gained perspective, purpose, and the unsettling realization that the life he'd built before was impressive in structure but hollow in foundation. He was still wealthy, still privileged, still operating in systems designed to benefit people like him at the expense of people like Margaret. But he was using those advantages differently now, building things that communities actually needed rather than things that displaced them for profit. It wasn't redemption, exactly. Redemption suggested completing a journey, earning forgiveness, arriving at some moral destination where past mistakes were absolved. Richard didn't believe in that kind of neat resolution. He'd been cruel and ignorant and complicit in systems that harmed people. Those facts didn't disappear because he'd changed direction. They remained part of his history, part of who he'd been and what he'd done. But Emma had been right about the fairy tale logic that children understood and adults forgot. Being heroic wasn't about one grand gesture that fixed everything. It was about choosing to be brave every day, even when it was hard, even when the results were uncertain, even when no one was watching to give credit. It was about walking towards something better rather than staying comfortable in something harmful. The Manila sun was setting, casting golden light across the community center that had been built through genuine partnership rather than imposed development. Children played in spaces designed with their needs considered. Families moved through affordable housing that didn't feel like punishment for poverty. And in the middle of it all stood a reformed billionaire, a woman who'd been invisible until she wasn't, and a 5-year-old who'd started a revolution by refusing to let French be a weapon of humiliation. Richard didn't know if what they were building would last. He didn't know if his reformed approach would survive contact with systems designed to reward exploitation. He didn't know if he was genuinely better or just better at performing consciousness. But he knew that tonight, when he returned to a home that felt lived in rather than showcased, he wouldn't lie awake calculating net worth or social status. He'd sleep like someone who'd done work that mattered, surrounded by people who saw him clearly, both who he'd been and who he was trying to become. And tomorrow, he'd wake up and try again. Because that's what redemption actually looked like, not a destination reached, but a direction chosen, day after difficult day, by people brave enough to believe that better was possible even when perfection wasn't. Emma's laughter echoed across the courtyard, teaching joy in a language that needed no translation, and Richard thought maybe that was the whole point. Maybe the most important lessons were the ones children understood instinctively, before adults taught them that dignity was negotiable, that cruelty was sophisticated, that the distance between who you were and who you could be was unbridgeable. Maybe growing up didn't have to mean growing cold. Maybe wealth didn't have to mean disconnection. Maybe power could be wielded for something other than dominance. Maybe a 3-year-old speaking French in a billionaire's mansion had understood more about justice, dignity, and human worth than all the powerful adults who'd spent that evening congratulating themselves on their superiority. And maybe, just maybe, the man who'd been humiliated into growth by that small act of courage was building something that honored the lesson she'd taught, that strength wasn't measured in how many people you could look down on, but in how many you chose to lift up when you finally opened your eyes and saw them standing there, waiting to be seen.